Rachel Miller had always lived in the shadow of precision. For nearly 2 decades, she worked in industrial quality control for a manufacturing firm in Akron, Ohio, where her days revolved around margins of error, tensile stress readings, and compliance documentation thick enough to level a table. She wasn't a perfectionist by nature. Life had long since ground that out of her, but years surrounded by steel tolerances and double-checked paperwork had trained her eye to see when something didn't align, when something was slightly off, even if the rest of the world missed it. So, when she pulled into the driveway of her new home for the 3rd time that week and noticed a faint shimmer of gray paint where her address numbers should have been, she didn't dismiss it. She stared at it, turned off the engine, and just sat there, frowning. She had bought the house in cash after negotiating a severance package that reflected years of seniority and silence. There was no bitterness about the job ending. Her department had been swallowed by automation. But the abrupt emptiness had left her twitchy. She didn't want an apartment, didn't want to share paper-thin walls with strangers. She wanted roots, permanence, somewhere that still creaked when you walked on the floorboards, somewhere no one could tell her when to leave. The house, tucked in a clean but unremarkable corner of a sun-drenched cul-de-sac in a town 2 hours outside Columbus, had seemed like a reasonable choice. Built in the late 70s, with a broad porch and a sloped yard, it wasn't fancy, but it was solid. Brick and wood and space enough to feel human again. The week she moved in had been spent in a flurry of cardboard boxes, curtain rods, and returning 3 different sets of drawer pulls that all somehow looked wrong once installed. By the end of the 6th day, she had just started to feel like things were in place, like the house was hers. She had memorized the sound of the fridge's hum, the rhythm of creaks from the hallway when the wind pushed against the siding, the way her living room windows lit up at precisely 4:12 p.m. with the low slant of sun. And then came the first delivery issue. The driver from the local furniture store called her cell phone, irritation already in his voice. "I've driven up and down the block. There's no number 616, he said flatly. "You gave us the wrong address." Rachel blinked. "No, that's definitely the address," she replied, walking out to the curb as she spoke. She turned to face the street, then looked down at the pavement. It wasn't just that the numbers were faded. They were gone. Not chipped, not eroded. They had been neatly painted over in a shade of gray that almost matched the concrete. She felt the same internal snap she used to get when an inventory record didn't match the shipment manifest. A wrongness you couldn't explain to someone until they saw it too. She thanked the driver, who eventually agreed to bring the sofa the next day after confirming her location via GPS, then walked back inside with a strange weight in her chest. That night, unable to sleep, she went back outside with a flashlight. Her eyes scanned the front of the house, the mailbox, the painted curb. Not a single number remained visible. Not even the outline of where they had been. Just smooth, flat anonymity. It wasn't just on the curb, either. Someone had carefully removed the small brass digits from the wooden frame by the door. The screw holes had been filled. The mailbox, a simple black metal fixture she hadn't thought twice about, looked slightly newer than the rest of the exterior. And yes, it too had no numbers. Rachel wasn't the panicking type, but there was a peculiar discomfort in realizing your home no longer existed in the most fundamental way. She wasn't delusional. She still received mail. The utility accounts had all been activated in her name. Her deed had the correct plot and street. But physically, visibly, her house no longer said who it was. That kind of deliberate erasure didn't happen by accident. By the 3rd day, she noticed small oddities piling up like static under the skin. A packet of misdelivered mail sat jammed in her neighbor's box, addressed to her. A grocery delivery service texted that her order had been left at a safe location, only for her to discover it abandoned at the entrance to the cul-de-sac. Worse, she overheard one of the postal workers mutter to himself while double-checking addresses, "They said nobody lives at 616 anymore." She went to the county registrar's office with a copy of her deed, fully expecting a simple explanation. or a clerical update. But the clerk behind the glass screen, while polite, furrowed her brow after a few keystrokes. "It's registered, but there's a flag," she said, tilting the monitor. "This parcel was marked as pending reclassification during the last administrative sweep. Says it's inactive pending residency validation. Did you recently purchase this?" Rachel nodded. "I've been living there for 2 weeks." The clerk leaned back and gave a helpless shrug. "Well, if you're in, I'd submit a revalidation request. Could take a few days, sometimes a week." "Who submitted the request to mark it inactive in the first place?" Rachel asked. The clerk hesitated, then checked a drop-down menu. "Local committee authorization," she read aloud before her voice dropped. "Civic Area Residents Network. Looks like they're the local oversight body here." Rachel had never heard of them. She hadn't signed anything involving them, hadn't attended any neighborhood meetings, but something about the name bothered her. It didn't sound like a traditional neighborhood association. It sounded like a corporation masquerading as a neighborhood club. She left the building with the papers for revalidation in her purse and a hard little knot forming at the base of her neck. That evening, as she trimmed a dying hedge in the front yard, a woman she hadn't seen before walked slowly past on the sidewalk. Mid-50s, athletic in a way that suggested money and time, with immaculately blow-dried hair and a slight smirk playing on her lips. "You just move in?" the woman asked, voice overly casual. Rachel nodded, cautious. "Couple weeks ago." The woman's gaze drifted lazily over the house. "Didn't realize anyone was living here yet," she said. "Thought it was still empty." Rachel looked at her, saying nothing. The woman smiled tightly and added, "Well, welcome. If you need help with anything, paperwork, orientation, just ask around. We like to know who's on the street." Then she was gone. Rachel stood still for a long time. The sunset behind the houses painted the trees in burnt gold, and the hedge trimmer buzzed faintly in her hand as if it too was waiting. There had been no threat in the woman's words. Not really. Nothing actionable. But something about her tone had carried an unmistakable message. You're being watched, and not in the curious neighborly way. In the calculated, procedural kind of way that says, you're on the board, but you don't know the rules. That night, Rachel sat at her kitchen table with every piece of mail she'd received since moving in. She cataloged it, checked dates, noted absences. A bill that never arrived. A welcome package she was told would come, but didn't. Even the weekly community flyer that had been crammed into every mailbox on the street. Every mailbox except hers. She opened her laptop and began making a list. Not a list of enemies. A list of patterns, systems, glitches that weren't glitches. Choices disguised as accidents. Her training had taught her one thing above all else. When a process breaks once, it could be a mistake. When it breaks 3 times the same way, someone built it to fail. And she was going to find out who. Not by shouting or filming or waving signs. That was for amateurs. No. Rachel Miller was going to trace it backwards, entry by entry, until she found the hand holding the brush that painted over her name. Because whoever had erased her from the street had done so quietly, assuming she would just disappear. And they were about to find out that Rachel didn't vanish. She projected. Rachel had learned to act early when systems started showing signs of failure. In her old job, hesitation could mean product recalls or contract losses. You didn't wait to see if the numbers corrected themselves. You verified the process, filed the report, and escalated if needed. She approached the situation with her house the same way. After her unsettling interaction with the woman on the sidewalk, who she later suspected was named Karen, after overhearing another neighbor mention her during a short conversation about committee updates, Rachel began quietly gathering information. She didn't want to make noise. She wanted clarity. First, she revisited the registrar's office, this time asking to see the full chain of administrative decisions tied to her property. The clerk, a different one this time, a man in his 40s with a permanent smudge on his glasses, seemed reluctant. But after a few key phrases like property rights and public documentation, he complied. He printed off 3 pages and handed them over with a shrug. "Doesn't mean much without context," he said. Rachel smiled politely and took the papers. She read the entries as she walked to her car. The printout was formatted like a procedural log. About 6 months prior, her address had been flagged for infrastructure audit pending. Then, 30 days later, it was listed as temporarily delisted for community compliance review. 2 months after that, the system simply marked it as inactive, awaiting verification. None of these entries appeared to have a direct source. Instead of a department or city staffer's name, the entries were attributed to something called CARN, Delegated Oversight. She froze halfway to her car. It was an acronym, not a department. Civic Area Residence Network. The same entity mentioned before. Back home, she searched every piece of documentation she had received at closing. Nothing mentioned CARN. Nothing about compliance reviews or revalidation. And she certainly hadn't signed up for anything that gave a third-party body the authority to interfere with her property's status. She called her realtor, a pleasant but exhausted-sounding woman named Denise. No, nothing was ever disclosed about CARN, Denise said. "I've heard of neighborhood boards, sure, but that sounds like some kind of committee spin-off." "You said they delisted your address," Rachel confirmed, and Denise grew silent for a beat. That's not normal. If they're touching legal identifiers, something's gone sideways." The conversation left Rachel with more unease than clarity. She spent the rest of the afternoon calling service providers, utilities, the internet company, even her mortgage-free property insurance. Most confirmed her address without issue, but 2, her water supplier and a local delivery logistics hub, told her they had her property listed under hold pending reverification, which, according to the operator, meant something like temporary blacklisting. The operator for the delivery service said, almost apologetically, "It usually happens when a property is being subdivided or repurposed, sometimes with condemned structures or disputed titles." Disputed titles. The phrase didn't just linger, it echoed. She decided it was time to contact a lawyer. Not to escalate yet, but to get her bearings. Rachel didn't want to jump to conclusions, but she also wasn't interested in being slowly peeled off the map by procedural whispers and clipped smiles. The lawyer she found, an older man named Eric Lawton, didn't wear suits or have a downtown office. He ran his practice out of a converted barn beside his farmhouse just outside town. The kind of place people overlooked until they realized he was the name judges trusted when it came to land boundary disputes and municipal overreach cases. Eric listened to her story with minimal interruption, scribbling notes as she spoke. When she handed him the 3 pages from the registrar's office, he scanned them, narrowed his eyes, and said, "That's administrative scaffolding." They're building justification before they act. Rachel asked what kind of justification. He looked up at her, one eyebrow raised. "Depends what they want. If they want your property to go vacant for a zoning argument, this builds precedent. If they're trying to reclassify your lot as part of a development initiative, they need to show your parcel was dormant. If they're just retaliating, well, then you've pissed someone off with too much time and paperwork access." Rachel's breath tightened. "What should I do?" Eric leaned back. "First, we get the legal land use map and see if there's anything already sketched out over your plot. Second, you file an official residency affirmation with the county, publicly. That makes it harder to erase you later." "And third," he said, pointing at the printout, "you ask them to provide the authority under which these notes were entered. Make them name the rule they're enforcing. Because if they're bluffing, they're banking on your silence." Rachel thanked him and drove home through quiet streets lined with crisp lawns and identically trimmed hedges. Everything looked normal, Yet every movement, every glance from a neighbor, every dog that stopped near her yard and didn't bark, felt loaded with something harder to define. There was a quiet consensus on the block, and she hadn't been included in it. That evening, just past dusk, her doorbell rang. Rachel opened it to find a clipboard held up in front of a man's face. "Hi, just doing a quick occupancy survey for the Civic Area Residents Network," the man said, lowering the clipboard. He was in his 20s, polo shirt with an embroidered patch, a walkie-talkie clipped to his belt. "We're updating local engagement records. Can I confirm your name and how long you've resided at this address?" Rachel didn't move. "I don't answer door-to-door surveys. It's just for our records. I didn't opt into your records." He smiled awkwardly. "Well, your house is on the block. That's how we do things here." Rachel tilted her head slightly. "Do things how?" He hesitated. "With transparency," he said finally, then scribbled something on his clipboard and walked off without another word. She watched him move down the street. No other doorbells rang. He walked straight to the end of the cul-de-sac, got into a beige sedan with no plates on the front, and drove off. Later that night, while pacing her hallway, Rachel opened her kitchen window for air. Across the street, 3 houses down, she spotted Karen standing in her driveway, speaking to someone. Perhaps on a phone or earpiece. She was gesturing toward Rachel's property. Calmly, like explaining a problem she'd already dealt with before. Rachel stepped back, turned off the kitchen light, and closed the curtain. When she went to check her mailbox the next morning, it was empty, but inside someone had slid a folded flyer with no postage. It wasn't addressed. It wasn't a warning. It was simply a welcome note from the Civic Area Residents Network. "We look forward to integrating your participation into our community compliance efforts." There were no numbers on the flyer. There were no names either, and Rachel realized in that moment this wasn't just an error or a bureaucratic oversight or some neighbor with a grudge. This was a design, and they were already executing it. Rachel woke up the next morning with the kind of clarity that usually only followed confrontation or fire. There had been no emergency, no storm, no break-in, but her body buzzed with alertness. She went through the motions of her morning: coffee, shower, opening the blinds, but her mind wasn't in it. Her house, which had once felt like a quiet retreat from the long years of corporate fatigue and narrow office windows, now hummed with a different tension. Not fear, not yet, but vigilance. She was being watched, managed, handled, and it was starting to become not just annoying, but dangerous. The flyer was still on her counter, folded into a neat triangle, its text soft and vague, written in the sort of language that used terms like community alignment and localized compliance architecture. Rachel had read it 3 times, and still couldn't find a single direct sentence. It didn't invite or instruct. It just assumed she was involved, assumed she understood what this Civic Area Residents Network wanted, assumed she'd be willing to let strangers track her presence like she was some variable on a spreadsheet. She tried calling the phone number listed at the bottom, just a string of numbers under a smiling clip art skyline, but it went straight to an answering service. A woman's voice offered a menu of options. Press 1 to hear about community standards, 2 to verify resident status, 3 to file a participation grievance. Rachel pressed 3, was told to leave her name and concern after the beep, and then the line cut out before she could speak. She tried again. The same thing happened. That afternoon, the mail didn't come. Her neighbors received theirs. She watched it from her window, but her box stayed closed. She walked down the sidewalk just to confirm she wasn't imagining it. Her box looked untouched. But when she opened it, there was one item inside. A small, glossy card that simply read, "Your residence is under review for external optimization." No envelope, no return address, no seal. She flipped it over. Blank. Rachel called Eric Lawton again. He picked up on the second ring. "It's escalating," she said. He didn't ask what she meant. "Describe what changed," he replied. She told him about the flyer, the survey visit, the mail disruption, and the note. She could hear him scribbling. "That's informal pressure," he said. "They're probing your reactions. They haven't filed anything new, yet, but they're working you over to see if you'll blink." Rachel asked what they wanted. Eric was quiet for a moment. "They want precedent. If you move out, if you yield control of the narrative, they can say the property was abandoned or cooperative with voluntary zoning adjustments. Once that happens, there's no more you. Just Lot 13B and an administrative report." Rachel's jaw tightened. "They're not getting Lot 13B. He gave her instructions. First, she needed visible reestablishment of address identity. Physical markers. Her numbers had to be visible, legible, non-removable. She needed to reattach the presence of her house to public reality. Second, she had to begin formal correspondence. Not reactive, but proactive. Letters to the county recorder, to the water service, to the postal branch, stating her status and demanding written confirmation of service. These weren't just for function. They were for the paper trail. Paper proved existence. Lastly, Eric advised, install nothing that could be used against her. No signs, no aggressive flags, no confrontational banners. "You don't want to look unstable," he said. "You want to look boring, predictable, painfully bureaucratic. Make them work for every inch." Rachel took it to heart. That afternoon, she drove into town, bought a full brass set of address numbers, not the cheap stick-ons. She installed them herself with proper bolts, not screws, drilling them directly into the brick by her porch light. She then painted the curb with a thick, high-contrast reflective paint she had custom-mixed at the hardware store. The numbers were crisp, deliberate. She sealed the paint with weatherproof epoxy. Then she took a photo with a time-stamped camera and emailed it to Eric along with her statements of physical re-identification. Bureaucratic warfare had begun. The next morning, the numbers on the curb were gone. Not painted over. Gone. The entire section of curb had been sprayed with industrial solvent. The paint had melted off in streaks and pooled at the base of the grass line. Rachel crouched beside it, took photos, then ran her hand across the surface. It smelled faintly of acetone and acid. Someone had done it overnight. Precisely. Without noise, without hesitation. Inside, she printed the photos and faxed them to Eric. She then called the sheriff's office not to report vandalism. Eric had advised her against that, but to request a patrol report. "I believe my property is being targeted for procedural tampering," she said clearly. "I want record of a suspicious incident filed. No criminal complaint, just notation." The deputy on the other end seemed puzzled but complied. An hour later, a cruiser rolled slowly past her house and logged the visit. It wasn't enforcement. But it was acknowledgement. Rachel ordered a new sign, a vertical metal plate with embossed numerals, sourced from a company that made fireproof signage for industrial zones. She installed it herself again, this time mounted on a steel post anchored into concrete near the porch. Not a decoration. Not symbolic. Just identification. Then she took things further. She visited the local post office in person. The building was tucked between a pharmacy and a bakery, with that distinct smell of paper and disinfectant. She asked to speak with the branch supervisor. The woman, polite but busy, listened to Rachel's concern and agreed to manually tag her house as verified. "But I'm going to be honest," the supervisor said. "If a property keeps bouncing back in the system, sometimes the algorithm flags it for deactivation. I've seen it with addresses involved in disputes. It's not always intentional. But it can take time to reverse." Rachel thanked her and left, stomach churning. She knew it wasn't just algorithmic. That evening, she found a new card in her mailbox. This one was heavier, made of laminated plastic. The front bore the CARN logo, a tree with its roots tangled into a grid of streets, and a message. Resident note: installation of unsanctioned signage violates civic integration protocols. Compliance review pending. There was no name, no return number. Just a QR code that led to a website under construction. The gloves were off. Rachel made one final move before nightfall. She returned to the hardware store and purchased a commercial-grade projection lamp, the kind used by realtors or businesses to throw logos onto sidewalks. She set it up in her garage, rewired the head, and replaced the internal stencil with a custom metal plate. That night, as the cul-de-sac settled into its dark hush, her garage door opened slowly. The projection beamed out in bold white light, 616, her address, cast clean and unmissable onto the front of the administrative hall 2 blocks down. It wasn't vandalism. It wasn't touching anyone's property. It was light, legal, visible, and it said everything she needed. She went back inside and made tea. No retaliation came that night, but her projection stayed, and that made her smile. The projection lasted 3 nights before anything changed. Rachel didn't expect it to spark outrage. She wasn't trying to provoke a reaction, not directly, but in a neighborhood so obsessed with appearances, the quiet defiance of her projected address looming over the administrative hall was louder than any complaint she could have filed. It wasn't graffiti. It wasn't trespassing. It wasn't even permanent. It was just information. But information, in the wrong place, at the wrong time, made people uncomfortable. That discomfort took shape on the 4th morning when Rachel stepped outside to find a white sedan parked across from her house, engine running, windows tinted just enough to hide expressions but not the silhouette of a person seated inside, watching. They didn't move. They didn't exit the vehicle. They simply remained, parked at a legal distance, saying nothing while saying everything. Rachel didn't acknowledge the car. She went about her morning tasks with methodical precision, placing the garbage bins neatly by the curb, double-checking the structural integrity of her mounted address plate, inspecting the projection angle from her garage. That night, the light remained off. Not because she turned it off, but because the bulb had been shattered. She found it the next morning, the glass carefully swept into a neat pile under the fixture. Not smashed on the ground, not scattered. Collected. As if someone had been kind enough to erase the evidence of their interference but cruel enough to do it with deliberate control. It was never about chaos. It was about presence. Rachel replaced the bulb, upgraded the fixture to a reinforced housing, and ordered a motion-sensing camera, not facing the street, not aimed at the neighbors, just trained on the projection unit itself. She wasn't trying to catch anyone in the act. She simply wanted to record every inch of what she already knew, that these weren't random acts. They were part of a system designed to outlast her patience. What unsettled her wasn't the aggression. It was the restraint. Whoever was coordinating this wanted to break her slowly, legally, just enough for her to walk away and let the system swallow her house whole. 3 days later, a man knocked on her door. He wasn't from the administrative body. He wore a uniform, but not a government one. A courier jacket, clean but worn, with a clipboard tucked under one arm and an envelope in hand. He introduced himself as working on behalf of a private logistics contractor handling regional communications for civic implementation entities. A phrase that sounded like it had been carefully engineered to sound harmless. He handed her the envelope and said, "You've been selected for address reassessment under subsection 8 of the Residential Optimization Framework. This is a notice of procedural invitation." Rachel opened it after he left. Inside was a multi-page document, formatted like a corporate onboarding packet, filled with jargon about parcel adjustments, optional integration, and community realignment benefits. She read through it twice and still found no concrete action being requested. Just suggestion, repetition. The consistent use of the word invitation, as though she had been chosen for a reward instead of targeted for erasure. She brought the packet to Eric Lawton the next day. He read it in silence, then flipped it over and stared at the blank backside. "This isn't legal action," he said at last, "but it's pretext. If you agree to anything in this packet, even just sign your name on that reply card, you're giving them consent to classify your property within their discretionary authority. That means they can begin a reallocation claim." Rachel didn't answer. She had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed made the weight of it settle somewhere deeper in her chest. Eric looked at her closely. "They're trying to bait you into legitimizing their reach. They're building a net, and they're hoping you step into it voluntarily." Rachel asked what happened if she ignored it completely. He leaned back, exhaled. "They escalate informally. Noise complaints, service disruptions, construction obstructions. Enough micro-pressure to make staying feel harder than leaving. They want you to break, not battle." That night, her internet went out. Then, the next day, the city marked the sidewalk in front of her house with fluorescent spray paint, orange lines running across the edge of her lawn. No notice, no explanation. She called the city's infrastructure division and was told it was preliminary mapping for utility realignment. Nothing was confirmed, but her property was being evaluated for environmental access upgrades. Another phrase that sounded innocuous until you picked at the words. Environmental, access, upgrade. It meant they wanted entry. It meant they might dig. It meant her land, her lawn, her frontage, was no longer being seen as hers. Rachel didn't panic. She documented. She printed, scanned, time-stamped. Every card, every notice, every painted line. She compiled them into a binder, organized by date, labeled with Post-it notes. Eric had advised her to be methodical, and she took it seriously. She became the archivist of her own siege. Then came the meeting notice. Folded and pushed through her door in an unmarked envelope, it invited her to a resident inclusion discussion, hosted by CARN at the local community hall, the same hall where her projected address had briefly lived in the light. The letter was neither threatening nor warm. It was administrative in tone, but the implication was clear. Show up and explain yourself, or be discussed in absentia. Rachel didn't want to attend. She didn't believe in the premise. But Eric advised otherwise. "They're laying groundwork to claim you're non-participatory. That's dangerous. You need to be seen, even if you say nothing." So she went. She dressed plainly, nothing provocative. She arrived 10 minutes early, sat in the back row of the small room filled with plastic chairs and tired coffee urns. Karen was there, of course, already engaged in conversation with two men in polo shirts that bore the CARN emblem. Rachel didn't interrupt. She watched. She listened. When the meeting began, her name was not spoken, but her house was discussed. "Lot 616 remains structurally sound but exhibits integration hesitation," said one of the committee members. "Our goal is to align all parcels with the optimization path by end of quarter." There were nods, murmurs of agreement. Rachel raised her hand once but was never acknowledged. When the meeting ended, she approached the man who had spoken. She introduced herself. He smiled professionally. "Ms. Miller, of course. We've reviewed your case with interest. We're confident we can bring your lot into alignment soon." She asked what that meant exactly. He waved a hand vaguely. "Just ensuring everyone is on the same map. Nothing invasive." Rachel looked him in the eye. "I'm already on the map." He smiled wider. "Not ours." And that was the moment Rachel understood that this wasn't just about compliance. It was about erasure. And they hadn't failed to see her. They were pretending she wasn't there on purpose. The meeting had changed nothing on paper, but everything in tone. Rachel left the hall not with anger but with precision humming beneath her skin. The way the committee members had spoken, with their practiced civility, their vague administrative phrases, their constant use of "we" when no vote had occurred, reminded her of internal audits she'd lived through during the collapse of her old company. It wasn't about collaboration. It was about perception management, about building a narrative in which any resistance could be reframed as obstruction. And now they were preparing to recategorize her as a non-compliant outlier. She hadn't even been called by name during the meeting. They spoke of uncooperative assets and unadjusted parcels, all the while looking directly at her without ever needing to acknowledge her presence out loud. That, more than anything, confirmed what she suspected. They weren't improvising, they were following a playbook. The next 3 days unfolded like clockwork. First, a city zoning officer arrived with a clipboard and camera, walking the edge of her property without making eye contact. Rachel stepped outside and asked what he was doing. He responded vaguely, saying he was mapping setback boundaries for potential utility routing. She asked for documentation. He handed her a printed slip that looked more like a receipt than a permit. The slip had her address written in pencil, not printed. The officer left after 10 minutes, having taken nearly a dozen photos of her fence, mailbox, and front yard. The following morning, her waste bins weren't emptied. The truck stopped, serviced both neighboring houses, and then rolled past hers. She called the sanitation department. The representative on the line apologized and said her service had been marked as inactive pending occupancy validation. She asked how that was possible when her utility bill was current and she had never missed a pickup. "It's probably a clerical error," the woman said, but she sounded tired, like it wasn't the first such call she'd fielded this month. By the end of the week, her address had stopped appearing on the neighborhood traffic map she used for work. It wasn't just missing. It had been replaced by a generic marker labeled parcel. When she searched city databases, her lot number remained correct, but her street address showed a dash in the residency column. Eric told her this was the start of soft deactivation. "They're removing you in layers," he said over the phone. "First from public visibility, then from internal systems. If they push it far enough, they'll get the city to sign off on reclassification due to inactivity. Once that happens, they can assign a conditional use permit to the land. Doesn't matter that you live there. If the system says you don't, they win." Rachel listened without breathing, her hands tight on the kitchen counter. "So, what do we do?" she asked. Eric sighed. "You force visibility. Don't argue with them. Don't make noise. You escalate bureaucratically. You request audits, file service complaints, demand physical inspections that require documentation. Paper creates friction. Friction slows systems." That's exactly what she did. She filed a mail obstruction claim with the Postal Service, requesting a regional review. She submitted a formal complaint to the Waste Management Office, citing service denial. She requested a certified survey of her land and installed a visible sign notifying that the survey was active. Then she contacted the county to request verification of her property's GIS coordinates and their compliance with public records. Each of these things took time, phone calls, faxes, and long drives. But each request left a paper trail, a presence in the system that couldn't be ignored or erased quietly. And she did it all without confrontation, without accusation. She treated the system like a machine that needed input, not a battle that needed winners. The response from the network came quickly and subtly. She found a yellow tag affixed to her rear fence post, a weatherproof sticker stating, "Hazard Review Area, Do Not Remove." No one had asked for entry to her yard. No one had sent notice. It simply appeared overnight. She called the city. They had no record of any hazard review order for her property. The sticker, they said, wasn't issued by them. It took a while, but with Eric's help she confirmed it had been printed by a private contractor frequently hired by the network's enforcement wing. It wasn't legally binding, but it looked official. That was the point. 2 days later, her internet went down again, this time for 3 days. The provider claimed a signal rerouting issue. When service resumed, her router logs showed several unexplained interruptions. The technician who came to check the line looked nervous when he saw her address. "I've been told not to modify anything without admin approval," he muttered. She asked which administration. He wouldn't say. She documented it all, sent it to Eric. "It's getting aggressive," she wrote. "They're testing infrastructure now." He called her the same day. "You need to prepare for a formal action. If they can't get you to leave or comply, they'll try to invoke external authority. Probably claim a violation, maybe even health code, something that gives them pretext." Rachel wasn't surprised. She'd already seen workers measuring near her foundation. She'd found one of her downspouts marked with a bright pink flag. There were no construction notices, no repairs scheduled. Just quiet probing. That weekend, the power flickered 3 times during a rainstorm. It wasn't the grid. Her neighbors didn't lose service. She checked her panel. Nothing tripped. She walked outside in the wet grass with a flashlight and found her main service meter had been accessed. The panel door was ajar, damp but not forced. The lock she'd installed had been snipped and left dangling. She took photos, filed a tampering report with the electric company, and then did something she hadn't planned. She contacted a journalist. Not for publicity. She didn't want a headline. She wanted record. She found a local investigative writer who focused on land use policy and quietly invited him to review her documentation. Not to write a story, but to witness. His name was Graham, and when he showed up, he didn't bring a camera. He brought a notepad and 3 pens. She handed him her binder. He sat at her dining table for nearly 2 hours, reading in silence. When he finally looked up, he didn't say she was paranoid. He didn't say she was overreacting. He said, "You're not the first. You might be the first who didn't just leave." Then he closed the binder and said, "Keep documenting. They're playing policy warfare. If you're still standing when they try the final push, that's the only time you'll have leverage." The next morning, Rachel received a letter from the city's Code Compliance Division. It stated that her property had been flagged for inspection due to unregistered modifications to external fixtures, including lighting. The letter referenced complaints from community oversight representatives and ordered her to cease projection activity until the investigation was complete. It wasn't unexpected. It was the exact play she'd been warned about. She faxed the letter to Eric, who prepared a challenge. But that night, Rachel made her own response. She didn't power up the projector again. Instead, she parked her car in the driveway and taped a single laminated sheet of paper to the windshield. Printed in bold black letters, "Parcel 616 is active. Occupied. Verified. Contested activity will be logged." The next day, someone left a dead bird on her doorstep. Not mutilated, just placed there. Rachel didn't react. She swept it into a bag, logged the incident, and moved on. That evening, she received an email. No subject line, no sender, just a plain message with one sentence. "You should really consider letting go." Rachel stared at it for a long time. Then she opened her documentation binder, added a new tab marked Threats, and printed the message. She wasn't leaving. They'd taken her address, but she'd rewritten herself in light. And light, even when shattered, always leaves a trace. Rachel had come to understand that the most dangerous part of a conflict like this wasn't the moments of open hostility. It was the long silences between them, when nothing visible happened but every instinct in her body told her the next strike was already in motion. The dead bird, the email, the disconnected services. These weren't errors or isolated events. They were signals, soft warnings from a system that didn't need to announce its intentions because it already believed it had the power to act without explanation. She kept to her routine with mechanical discipline, responding not with emotion but with record-keeping, never reacting impulsively, never reaching out to escalate. She followed every instruction Eric gave her, responded to every letter with the correct form, filed every required document, and built a paper wall around herself so dense and so tedious that it became a barrier in its own right. But even so, she knew what was coming. And when it finally arrived, it didn't come with sirens or police or public confrontation. It came at 7:18 on a Wednesday morning, in the form of 3 men in city-issued reflective vests who knocked on her door and calmly informed her they were conducting an external compliance verification as part of a community safety protocol. She asked to see the order. They provided a laminated pass clipped to a folder with her parcel number printed in bold. "This is just a non-invasive perimeter check," one of them said. "You don't need to be present." She insisted. She followed them outside and stayed close as they moved slowly along the edge of her property, measuring setbacks, noting angles, photographing utility junctions. None of them entered her house or touched her structures, but she noticed something she wasn't meant to see. One of them dropped a small GPS device near her rear shed, as if casually checking his tool belt. She picked it up the moment they left, took photos, and mailed it in a sealed envelope to Eric. No return address, just a sticky note. Found during compliance check. Unknown origin. 2 days later, a citation arrived. It stated that her home was in violation of lighting ordinances due to unauthorized night illumination that could pose disruptive influence to community infrastructure. No specifics. No timestamps. No photographic evidence. Rachel understood then that they had shifted fully into institutional mode. No more tests. No more probes. Now they would simply declare and enforce. She knew the pattern. They'd build violations, use them to justify a hearing, then apply pressure through fines or conditional occupancy threats. And once a property was flagged as administratively unstable, it could be subject to forced easements, forced rezoning, or even condemnation in cases of public inconvenience. She faxed the citation to Eric, who filed a notice of challenge and scheduled a hearing request. But the system had already moved. That night, Rachel's water pressure dropped to a trickle. When she called the city, they claimed there was no known outage in her zone. A technician came 3 days later, glanced at her meter, and quietly said, "This was capped." Rachel asked who authorized it. He didn't know. "There's no work order," he admitted. "Looks manual." Someone tagged it as restricted. She asked if he could restore it. He hesitated. "Not without clearance. I can log it as unauthorized service disruption, but it'll go up the chain." Up the chain meant through CARN, the same committee that was already constructing the framework for her removal. Rachel didn't wait for the next escalation. She went to the county courthouse and filed for an emergency injunction against any infrastructural modification to her property pending investigation of improper interference by non-governmental administrative entities. It was a long shot. Most judges wouldn't take it seriously, but her documentation was dense and her presentation was calm. When the hearing was scheduled, she arrived early, binder in hand, and presented her case to a judge who looked skeptical until he read the stack of letters with no signatures, the notices with no legal basis, and the service records showing repeated, unexplained disruptions. After 30 minutes, he granted the temporary freeze. That victory didn't stop the system. It only delayed it. Within 72 hours, Rachel received a thick envelope hand-delivered by a courier in a black sedan. Inside was a formal notice of civic reassignment. Her parcel had been reviewed and designated as infrastructure adjacent, and as such was subject to conditional integration into the Unified Zone Development Project. The letter claimed this was a standard administrative adjustment and offered a goodwill compensation for voluntary relocation. Attached was a check, unsigned, but with her name printed in bold. No amount was filled in. The signature line read, pending integration terms. Rachel stared at it for a long time. Then she picked up her phone and called Graham, the journalist. She didn't need a headline. She needed insurance. When he arrived, she handed him a copy of the reassignment letter and the blank check. He looked at her for a long moment. "They're trying to buy silence," he said, "but they don't want to admit to buying. So they're offering fiction." She nodded. "You still willing to be my witness?" she asked. He didn't answer. He just took the folder and slipped it into his briefcase. Rachel called Eric and told him what had happened. He was quiet for a moment, then said, "They're moving fast." "This isn't about you anymore. This is about precedent. They're testing how far they can push administrative authority under the cover of local development language. If they win here, they'll use this model everywhere." Rachel asked what their next move would be. Eric's voice lowered. "If you won't leave, and you won't sign, and the city won't force a zoning override, then their last move is reclassification through code, safety, health, something they can claim is outside of their hands." That weekend, an inspector from the city's environmental division arrived unannounced. She wore a badge, carried a tablet, and walked slowly through the property, citing airflow mapping and drainage conformity. Rachel stayed close, filming nothing, just taking notes. The woman didn't speak much, but Rachel noticed she took multiple samples from the soil, then made several calls, too quiet to overhear. When she left, she handed Rachel a carbon copy of a service slip. It didn't say what she was testing for. Rachel sat in her kitchen that night, looking at the map she'd drawn of her house, the markers of every action taken against her. And then she did something she hadn't done since the beginning. She turned the projector back on. But this time, she didn't aim it at the administrative hall. She aimed it at the sky. The address shone upward against the haze of suburbia, visible only faintly, but enough to catch in the low-hanging mist. It didn't say 616. It said, "We're still here." Then she printed a copy of every single record in her binder, boxed them up, and mailed them to 3 addresses: Eric, Graham, and the state attorney's office, certified delivery. She didn't need them to act. She just needed them to know. Because the next move was coming, and she was ready. It didn't end with an order. It didn't end with an apology. It ended with the slow, grinding machinery of process losing traction. The morning after Rachel projected "We're still here" into the sky, a storm moved through the area, scattering the clouds, silencing the neighborhood in that hushed way only heavy rain could. There were no knocks at her door, no new tags on her property, no silent observers parked across the street. It felt less like retreat and more like a system in reset, as if the committee had reached the edge of what they could justify without inviting outside scrutiny and chose for now to pause. But the damage was already done. The binder of records, the documentation, the formal filings, and the testimony Graham had begun assembling as a pattern, none of it disappeared with the weather. It lingered, like oil soaked into soil, quiet but irreversible. 2 days later, a letter arrived, not from the network, not from the city, but from the State Office of Land Use Compliance. It stated that a preliminary investigation had been opened following concerns over procedural overreach within local administrative subdivisions. It was dry, clinical, utterly without emotion, but to Rachel it read like a confirmation. Something in the system had blinked. Someone, somewhere, had looked at the pattern and said, "This shouldn't be happening." Eric called the same afternoon. He had received the same notice, and his voice, while cautious, carried a note of something rare: relief. "This won't be a fast process," he warned her, "but once they're under review, they freeze. That means no more flags, no more reclassification, no enforcement. They'll hunker down, they'll wait it out, but they can't touch you for now." Rachel thanked him and hung up. The wind outside shifted. She stepped onto her porch and looked across the street. The lawns were still clipped short, the trash bins were lined up with ruler precision, and the silence hung heavy, as it always had. But for the first time, it didn't feel like a threat. It felt like a system trying to maintain itself in the face of a failure. She had forced their hand, not by rebellion, not by spectacle, but by endurance. She had stayed. Karen didn't speak to her again. She saw her once across the block during a midday walk, and their eyes met for just a second, long enough to register acknowledgement, but not respect. Rachel didn't care. The woman's power had always been borrowed from the silence of others, and now that silence was broken. Graham eventually published a report, not a hit piece, not an exposé, just a meticulous article outlining the rise of unregulated residential committees gaining quasi-governmental power through document layering and ambiguous authority. Her name was changed, the address omitted, but the pattern was there, and those who knew, knew. It spread slowly, picked up by forums, shared among legal circles, whispered through real estate offices. Not a scandal. A caution. Rachel kept her projector. She didn't use it often, but sometimes, on clear nights, she would aim it at the low fence bordering her property and let the numbers glow softly against the wood, just for herself. Not as a warning, not as defiance, just as proof. She replanted the front garden, fixed the mailbox, and painted over the faint solvent stains on her curb. It wasn't a declaration of victory. It was continuity. She renewed her survey permit, not because it was necessary anymore, but because she wanted a fresh timestamp in the records, something the next person couldn't erase. The Civic Area Residence Network never sent another notice. No further action was taken. They didn't fold, didn't vanish, just shrank back into the shadow of administrative ambiguity from which they'd emerged. And the systems that had so confidently moved against her now logged her presence as permanent, verified, certified. Not because they had changed their minds, but because the weight of record had made removal too risky. Rachel never told anyone she won. That wasn't the point. This wasn't about a single conflict or a single house. It was about the right to remain, to not be written out just because it was cleaner, simpler, easier for someone else. She had protected her place not by fighting louder, but by refusing to be erased quietly. In the end, she